Reverend Jim Jones was one of the most bizarre religious leaders America has ever known. On November 18, 1978, he ordered his followers to commit suicide. Why did over 900 people follow one man to their doom? How did Jim Jones control so many lives?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
I want you to be like I am. I want you to become what I am. I want you to enjoy the fearlessness that I have, the courage that I have, the compassion that I have, the love that I have, the all-encompassing mercy that I am. I want you to be what I am and something greater. And if you don't want to go this route, then go to hell where you want to, but don't bother me.
The Reverend Jim Jones, born 1931, died November 18, 1978, with 913 of his followers in the jungle settlement of Jonestown, Guyana. How did it happen? What was the basis of Jim Jones' frightening power over his followers? If his story is told again, will it serve as a lesson for now? James Warren Jones came from a poor southern Indiana family. Jimmy was a serious-minded but rebellious boy who became captivated by fundamentalist Christianity. In what was then a stronghold of the Ku Klux Klan, the young Jones preached racial integration and utopian socialism. To finance his first interracial church, he sold live monkeys door to door. In 1965, Jones moved his congregation to Redwood Valley, California. Haunted by visions of nuclear apocalypse, he declared that here at last was a safe place to build his utopian community, the People's Temple.
Level of society, all socioeconomic income strata, from professional down to the ordinary field worker, field labor, and mill worker. Really, it's beautiful to see that all these divisions have been broken down, not only race, but any differences of economic position, but just a warm fellowship and acceptance of all people. We started with about 141 people, and from that we've grown to a very thriving congregation of a few thousand. I didn't think you'd retire.
Not around you.
Jones achieved extraordinary rapport with people, especially with the aged and with blacks.
Thank you for inviting me in.
To those who felt useless and unwanted, he offered respect and love.
I'm about to go.
Jim Jones was a fiery minister who ridiculed the Christian deity as an impotent sky god.
I'm not here to teach you about no sky god or pie in the sky or sweet pie god. I'm here to teach you that what you see is what you get. You don't not.
Grace Stone was a top aide to Jim Jones.
Jim Jones wasn't a Christian. He was an atheist, and Jim used to have people bring the Bibles into the church, and he would throw them down, he would stomp on them, he would spit on them, and he would talk about using the pages for toilet paper.
Debbie Layton was a member of the Temple Planning Commission.
Jim Jones was a brilliant man. Clever, deceitful, and evil, but he was very, very clever. And he read all the books on sociology and psychology and other cults and brainwashing, and he knew exactly what to say and what to do to impress and influence other people.
You'll see him walk on this lake like nothing was ever wrong.
Jones was a gifted showman, an expert practitioner of faith healing. According to numerous reports, most of the healings were phony, but they appealed especially to fundamentalist worshipers who had a long tradition of theatrics and high emotion in their religion.
I think that Jones was able to attract a lot of people into the church because he got to these people at a point in their life where they were vulnerable, be it they were in the middle of a divorce, or they were depressed, or they were lonely.
I was a very, very rebellious kid, and Jim used guilt to bring me into the church and keep me there. He said people from affluent backgrounds that are spoiled cannot stay in a group like this, cannot stay in a structured life and give of themselves to other people. And I was determined that I cared about other people, and I was going to stay in people's temple.
Walk with me, walk. You had an instant family, you had instant friends, you never had to be alone. If you had any problems, you always had someone to go to. You were just never alone. You always had support, and that's very powerful.
Charles Gary was People's Temple attorney for 2 years.
Jim Jones had tremendous charisma. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've ever met anybody with more charisma. He was very fascinating, very enthusiastic in what he had to say, and very convincing. It's only when you began to read between the lines as you knew him over a period of time that you began to get the feeling that he had a tremendous ego, and that ego was almost destructive.
As temple membership soared, Jones became increasingly political. He mobilized thousands to help elect the late San Francisco mayor, George Moscone, who rewarded him with the prestigious directorship of the Housing Authority.
Jim Jones was highly respected in San Francisco. He supported Ronald Reagan as governor and Richard Nixon. He was a tremendous champion of free speech, civil rights, civil liberties, anything that was progressive and good.
Along with Jones' increasing power came fear of media persecution. On one occasion, he gave permission to film services in Los Angeles, but suddenly reneged on his promise.
I really don't feel comfortable with our worship being photographed. I really don't. I must go against the entire council. I don't feel good about it. They can photograph me all they choose, because I do not care. I'm fearless. But I don't want the cameras focusing on others. I don't want them. Ask me your questions, and I'll tell you right straight from the shoulder where I stand. You want to get out there?
What was passing between this man and his congregation? It was perhaps a form of romance, but as time went on, Jones seemed to change. The dark side of his personality came to the fore.
Every single member of your family had to get on the floor and say something negative about you. And that was to break down any ties and unity within a family, so that when you did come to the realization that something was wrong and you wanted to leave, you could not feel the bond to go to a family member and say, listen, something's wrong here, let's get out.
To this,
Tommy Bogue was 7 years old when his parents brought him to People's Temple.
They had these little kids, maybe 6, 7 years old, go into this room and then make them grab hold of these electrode things and then start turning up the electricity on, and they'd put a microphone next to the door and you start hearing them screaming, you know, I mean, it sounds, I mean, it's bloody chilling is the only way I can really put it.
After critical articles appeared in the San Francisco Examiner, Jones staged a demonstration.
All of these allegations are totally untrue. I'm principled and dedicated to my people, and they are also committed to the Christian ethic, the Judeo-Christian ethic of service. Certainly anyone who wants to investigate our organization, we're more than open to it by any honestly inquiring group or otherwise.
So intimidating was Jones's demonstration that the newspaper canceled its series of articles on People's Temple.
I think that Jones probably was an unhappy person. Deep down inside, he didn't believe in himself. And so he was constantly having to attain more money to be more secure, more political friends. Jones would freak out when anybody would speak against the church or him.
Jim hated men. He was very insecure. And only women became the top aides to him.
According to Debbie Layton, in the book In My Father's House, Jones appropriated her brother Larry's first wife, Carolyn. When Larry remarried, Jones also seduced his second wife, Karen.
Because
Ex-Temple member Richard Clark.
I think that Jones was burning up with lust. Matter of fact, he finally told her one night, he finally said that he would like to have sex with everybody in the temple, you know.
Every single woman that was on the planning commission was approached by Jim Jones and forced into a sexual relationship. And I consider it rape. I was raped by Jim Jones.
In late 1977, New West magazine printed a blistering expose of People's Temple. Grace Stone sued for custody of her 6-year-old son, who Jones claimed was his child. Jones reacted to his difficulties by moving Temple members 6,000 miles to Jonestown, a settlement he had started earlier in Guyana. Here, Jones would have to answer to no man. Jonestown would be a world unto itself.
Flour, rice, black-eyed peas, more peas. We have different containers around the place. We couldn't go through all the tremendous inventory they built up. Kool-Aid.
What a swing! What liberation brings!
The first time I went there in October of 1977, I came back and I said I saw a paradise. They had their own electricity, they had their own generators, they had the most perfect medical setup I have ever seen. Everything was immaculate, everything was good, and everything was decent.
When fascist terror brings concentration camps or brings massive food riots, you have a home.
You just can't imagine that all the hundreds of us here are so extremely happy. I wish I could describe the whole thing to you, but it's hard. But I just must say this. I can't help but say that none of this would have been possible had it not been for Jim Jones.
I thank you, Jim. You have certainly made a way for us, and everybody seems to be so happy. I am pleased. Thank you, Jim.
I don't want to go back to the States because this place is better.
That was pretty much an ideal situation because, like, you could see progress happening. You know, you had a sense of you're creating a town. But then when Jones came down there, that all changed. They started having the long meetings till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. They started having 12-hour work days, and the discipline started getting into the extremes. And, I mean, it just became a hellhole.
When I got to Jonestown, the first thing Jones asked me was how did I want to die? And he asked me, did I want to die fighting? Did I want to take the portion? Then I knew what I was up against then. It was death that Jones had chosen for us.
As more people packed into Jonestown, food supplies ran low. Jones controlled millions in temple funds, but refused to spend it on food or adequate housing. Isolated in the jungle, news from outside came to him in radioed fragments. His fears and suspicions multiplied.
Quite likely I'll be there for both.
For 900 people, life became an answer to one man's whim. Jonestown was their entire reality. Jim Jones was their God.
I woke up and I had a constriction, I guess, in my chest or in my stomach, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe at all. I didn't even call on Father. I thought of him, and it all was right. Thanks, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Around Jones was just like a force field of evil. It would even take your mind, just like you couldn't even think when you was around Jones, because it's the force that he had built up.
The most frightening things about Jonestown were that there were armed guards surrounding the camp at all times, and while you worked in the field, they watched you, and you weren't allowed to speak to your neighbor, and you had to work double time. And Jim Jones's voice went over the loudspeakers 24 hours a day, while you ate, while you worked in the field, and while you slept.
When Grace Stone carried her custody battle for her son John into Guyanese courts, Jones was beside himself.
If by any chance you would make a mistake to try to come in and take any one of us, we will not let you. You will die. You will have to take anybody over all of our dead bodies.
Jim Jones was not sane. He had not been sane since I saw him in August of 1978. His paranoia was destructive. I warned him about his paranoia, but he treated that as though I was an enemy.
I got a hell of a lot of weapons to fight. I got my claws, I got guns, I got dynamite, I got a hell of a lot to fight. I'll fight, I'll fight,
By mid-November 1978, concerned relatives of Temple members persuaded Congressman Leo Ryan to visit Jonestown. Ryan brought reporters and a network news team. Nothing could have triggered more dread in Jim Jones. At first, the visit was a success for Jones. Ryan and reporters saw only the superficial, positive side of Jonestown. The next morning, however, 10 people, including Richard Clark, fled into the jungle. Several other families told the Ryan party they wanted to leave. Jones could not change their minds.
Congressman Ryan came over to him and he said, Jim, don't be upset about this. He said, if half of the people here were to leave, I would still say you have the most beautiful place. It's a dream.
Jones would not be soothed. Is it conceivable that he was mentally unstable from an early age, a borderline psychotic who attempted to realize his paranoid delusions of grandeur? Now his dreams seemed to crumble around him.
People play games, friend. They lie, they lie. What can I do about liars? Are you people going to leave us? I just beg you, please leave us. Bill, we will bother nobody. Anybody wants to get out of here can get out of here. We have no problem about getting out of here. They come and go all the time. I don't know what kind of game. People like, people like publicity. Some people do. I don't.
Emotions ran high as the defectors left with the Ryan party. Tommy Bogue was among them.
So we're going down the road, and then they stop to take some pictures further along. When they stop, we tell them, don't stop, keep going, because something's going to happen. So we come into the airport, and that's where we all get off and we wait for the airplanes. And I loaded onto the big airplane, and I was sitting right across from the door in the back. Okay, and then that's when we saw the tractor and trailer coming around.
When the shooting stopped, Congressman Ryan, 3 newsmen, and young Patty Parks lay dead. 10 others, including Tommy Bogue, were wounded. Odell Rhodes is one of the few surviving eyewitnesses to what happened next in Jonestown.
Jim Jones came over the speaker system himself, and he called everyone to a general meeting.
It's too late. The congressman's dead, the congressman Lee's dead, many of our traitors are dead, they're all laying out, they're dead.
He told us that the Guyanese army would parachute in on us, and they would torture older people and babies, and that, you know, when they come, you know, we should all be dead.
If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed.
And I was just looking, I mean, here are people my age, older people, younger people, and they were, for the most part, they were voluntarily taking at the time. They were voluntarily drinking poison.
This is a revolutionary suicide. This is not a self-destructive suicide. Please, for God's sake, let's get on with it. We've lived as no other people have lived and loved. We've had as much of this world as you're going to get. Let's just be done with it. Let's be done with the agony of it.
Eyewitness Stanley Clayton.
Some people was not getting up out of their seat. They were sitting there, you know, scareless, you know, to death, you know, they don't want to do this. Where people with Jim Jones there, you know, imposing himself on these people, pulling people out of the chair, you know, and saying, it's time, you know, we do not want, you know, the GDF to come in here and castrate us, or we do not want them to come in and shoot us down like dogs, you know, let's die with dignity and so forth. And the fact that people listened to that, but then there were some that didn't listen to that, and those who did not listen to that were forcibly pulled up out of their seats. If they didn't go over there, they were injected right there.
Hurry, my children, hurry. They does not fall into the hands of the enemy. Hurry, my children. Quickly, 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 quickly.
Odell Rhodes and Stanley Clayton escaped into the jungle. When Odell returned with Guyanese officials, they found Jim Jones shot in the head. Of 914 dead, only he and his nurse had not taken poison. Jim Jones and most of his followers are gone, but disturbing questions remain. Is our present society especially vulnerable to men like Jones? Are there other cults in America with tragic potential? Reportedly, there are still people who venerate Jim Jones, who sleep with his picture, and who feel he is the only person who ever loved them. Organizations that offer solutions to all of life's problems can be seductive, but also perilous. Might the lesson of Jonestown help people avoid the danger?
The church was bizarre at the end, but it didn't start out that way. What a person saw the church in the beginning and what they saw afterwards were two different things. People were tricked, and I believe that most people can be tricked.
They were called the People of the Sun and believed that they were elected by their tribal god to carry out the destiny of the world. Guided by this religious imperative, the Aztecs fought their way to domination of the Western Hemisphere. They exacted tribute from over 30 other city-states. In 1519, ruled by the priest-king Montezuma, they were at the zenith of their power. But on April 22nd of that year, a small army of 508 soldiers, led by Conquistador Hernan Cortez, landed on the shore of Mexico. Why did Montezuma refuse to fight this enemy that would ultimately imprison him and change the face of the New World?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Montezuma, king of the Aztecs, is about to meet his destiny. It is the 8th of November, 1519, and it is one of the most unusual confrontations in all of history. He believes he is meeting a god. But this god is in the form of Conquistador Hernan Cortez, who had reached Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, by a combination of shrewd strategy and a mystical confidence that his time in history has arrived. At his side is the Indian woman known as La Malinche, who is his translator and a key to his understanding of the Indian people. Today, in the center of Mexico, workers are uncovering the great temple of the Aztecs. The site was discovered by chance in 1978, and both as a structure and as a symbol is the most important single site in the Aztec world. Dr. David Carrasco is a professor at the University of Colorado.
The Aztecs lived in the north, in a place called Chicomostoc, or the place of 7 caves, and there, their god Huitzilopochtli appeared to the shaman priest in a dream, telling the priest that he should move the people to another location, and that location would be marked by an omen in the landscape. And there they were told that if they built their city in this place, their city would be the queen of all of the cities in Mexico, to whom people would come as one supreme among all the others. It was at this very spot that the Templo Mayor was built.
The remains of the temple and the few other artifacts that survived the conquest tell us of the awesome power of the Aztecs. Since religion was at the core of their society, their pyramids were built on a scale more fitting of gods than men. The Aztec calendar was invented by priests who were well versed in astronomy, and it was remarkably accurate. More accurate, in fact, than the Roman calendar we use today. Their nobles and priests were schooled in history, religion, and prophecy. They were not only learning from their past, but believed they could predict their future. Their conquests had enabled them to create a world of luxury, and their lush gardens fed their growing armies and put flowers on the tables of their nobility.
The primary sources that we have depict Moctezuma II as a highly sensitive, very spiritual, and deeply concerned Tlatoani, or king, who had a very close relationship to the major deity of the Aztecs, Huitzilopochtli. He carried the influence and the power of Huitzilopochtli in his own heart. He was the spokesman for this great deity.
The Aztecs had a cyclical concept of time. Every 52 years, a new cycle began, and the gods had to be appeased at these crucial periods to assure the continued prosperity of their civilization. The year 1519 was the beginning of a new cycle, and there were ominous signs that their world was in danger.
The Aztecs tell their story of the conquest in a very unusual way. They begin their story of how their world came to an end by telling not how the Spaniards first came to their land, but by telling that there were omens in the sky, signs in their own heavens, which indicated that their world, or their cosmos, was coming to an abrupt and violent end. The first omen that appears is a rip in the sky, which bleeds drop by drop onto the Aztec world, celestial influences. The second omen is a thunderbolt, which hits and burns down the temple of the great god Huitzilopochtli. A number of omens follow which indicate that the Aztecs understood their own collapse as originating with celestial influences, not the presence of Spaniards.
The final omen was the most frightening. One night, throughout Tenochtitlan, a woman's cry was heard. My children, we are lost." It came from everywhere and from nowhere, and the people were afraid. It is an eerie fact that the arrival of Cortez was foretold by the Aztec prophecies. Irony and coincidence played instrumental parts in the collision of these two great cultures. It was as though some guiding force had arranged the elements of this great drama, which the characters then acted out. We have records of this historic event in a personal account written by Bernal Diaz, a soldier in Cortez' army, and in the colorful picture writings of the Aztecs themselves. Both cultures seem to confirm the warning of the omens. But Professor James Lockhart has a different interpretation.
The omens tell us mainly what the Aztecs, or the Indians of that area, were thinking many years after the conquest. Most of the ones we have are a generation or generation and a half. They're their attempt to explain what happened. And the kinds of things that we have, astronomical phenomena, strange animals, and the like, are part of a standard repertoire that these people often use to explain bad things that happen to them after the fact.
Cortez was totally unaware of the Aztec situation when he approached the shores of Mexico. His main concern was keeping his expedition together, and to prevent desertion, he burned his ships after he was ashore. The great god Quetzalcoatl was prophesied to return on the very day that Cortez lands, and Montezuma has his people watching the coast in anticipation of this momentous event. A messenger brings him drawings of these beings, and the light-skinned, bearded figures are frighteningly similar to the traditional description of their god. Montezuma is overwhelmed and afraid to receive this mythical being, but also afraid to arouse his anger by keeping him away. What hand was guiding the Cortez expedition to land on that exact day? The mission was nearly aborted many times. Even as it got underway, conflict and uncertainty made it doubtful whether it would ever reach its destination. Yet, Cortez's sense of destiny pushed him on, ironically fulfilling the Aztec prophecy. Who knows where or how the Quetzalcoatl legend originated? His image was on every temple in the empire. The more fantastic theories see in Quetzalcoatl an Irishman, Norseman, or even Atlantean, who had landed on Mexico's shore in some ancient time.
Quetzalcoatl was important because he ruled a magnificent kingdom, a magnificent city-state in which there was abundance, harmony between the gods and human beings, agricultural stability. But at a certain point in the golden day of Quetzalcoatl's kingdom, he had to leave, but he promised to return one day and restore the abundance and stability of this marvelous situation. It appears from the primary sources that we have that when the Spaniards began to march inland in 1519, led by Cortez, that the Aztecs, and especially the Aztec king Moctezuma, interpreted the presence of the Spaniards as the return of this king Quetzalcoatl. And he investigated this identity in a number of ways. First of all, he sent out some representatives to paint pictures of Cortez and the Spaniards so that these pictures could be brought back and compared with the pictures that they had of their own Toltec ancestors. Secondly, Moctezuma sent out food to see if the Spaniards would eat the Indian food, would recognize it. Were they indeed human beings, or were they other kinds of beings, or were they some sort of combination of beings, human beings and supernatural beings?
Many of the Indians near the coast do not share Montezuma's reverence for these intruders and want to drive them out. But their fighting methods are no match for the Spaniards.
The battles between the Spaniards and the Indians usually ended in Spanish victory. The Spaniards had the great advantage of steel, which both offensive and defensive gave them an advantage that the Indians simply could not equal. The steel sword could cut through anything the Indians had. The steel helmet could not be penetrated by anything the Indians had. The other great advantage that the Spaniards had was the horse, which fulfilled the function, essentially, of a tank in modern warfare. And these two then were used in conjunction. A fairly large body of Spanish footmen with their swords would hack away at huge numbers of Indians, killing them and killing them and killing them until they got tired. Whereupon the horsemen would burst out and push the Indians back, which they could do. And then they would return to inside the Spanish group, and the Spaniards would begin doing it all over again.
After being defeated on the battlefield, several tribal emissaries beg for peace and bring gifts as a sign of friendship. Cortez uses the occasion to further impress upon them his invulnerability. He has a horse brought to him, knowing that to them, this is a beast of the most fearsome proportion. He is quick to take advantage of the moment. He takes the helmet of one of his soldiers and calls back the frightened envoys. He then commands them to take the helmet to Montezuma and have it filled with gold. Even this helmet seems to be an object of wonder to them.
It appeared to them that this helmet was very similar, if not the same kind of helmet, which the great Aztec deity Huitzilopochtli wore. We're told that the helmet was taken to Moctezuma, and when he saw it, he marveled at this possibility, and in fact compared it to the helmet which was associated with Huitzilopochtli, and was very impressed by the similarity, and in fact afraid.
Montezuma does as commanded, but still, he sends the message for Cortez to come no further. At the heart of the Aztec belief system was fear. Fear of the apocalypse, which would inevitably come and annihilate the tribe. The function of the Aztec priests was to postpone this apocalypse as long as possible. And this could only be accomplished by pleasing the many gods with the hearts of human sacrificial victims.
There are Aztec myths, Aztec stories, which tell that the Aztec city itself, the great temple of the Aztecs, was created as a result of the sacrifice of deities. These stories of sacrifice of gods became the models for the ritual system and the ritual processes of the Aztecs themselves. That is, as the gods had sacrificed themselves to give life to human beings were asked to sacrifice other human beings, which was understood to feed the deities and regenerate the world.
Cortez receives his helmet, along with the warning not to come. One of the other tribes is more emphatic. We are going to kill these who are called gods and offer them up for sacrifice. Cortez gathers his men to pray for good fortune and strength against an enemy that outnumbers them more than 1,000 to 1. Against such overwhelming odds, it seems foolhardy for Cortez to continue his advance. But his ambition propels him forward, and the lure of wealth and power keeps his troops behind him.
One of the most repulsive dimensions which the Aztecs felt about the Spanish invasion of their country was the Spanish greed for gold. The Aztecs said of the Spaniards, they're like dogs seeking gold. Gold is their sickness.
The lure he holds out to the Indians of Mexico is freedom from Aztec domination. He will use every tactic at his disposal, every weapon in his arsenal, and every person in his path, in his determination to become master of the New World.
People have been saying for a long time that Cortez didn't tell it right. He overpraises Mexico as to its great extent and population and wealth. Not that it wasn't impressive, but he doesn't really care about that so much as he wants to impress the emperor back home that what a service he has done in giving him such a huge principality. He also over-evaluates the religious component and the patriotic component in what he's doing. They may have been very real too, but that wasn't really the reason that he did what he did. But in his letters back home, it appears that his whole motivation is Christianity and service to the emperor, when actually his motivation is that he be confirmed as governor.
Even after consulting with his gods, Montezuma can think of nothing to avoid the impending disaster. Cortez is invulnerable in battle and immune to magic spells. He certainly must be a god. It was ages ago that Quetzalcoatl was driven out of the land by a rival deity, and now with his return, there will be a clash between the two powers that will do incalculable damage.
As the Spaniards were approaching the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, they expected to see something magnificent and great, because they had heard about Moctezuma's great city, the great temple of Tenochtitlan, and the mighty power of the Aztec nobility. When they entered the city, what they saw was even much more magnificent.
Bernal Diaz describes the Spaniards' approach to the capital city. When we saw the town with buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, it seemed like an enchanted vision. Some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. Montezuma himself greets them as they enter the city center with these words: "O Lord, with what trouble have you journeyed to reach us, have arrived in this land, your own city of Mexico, to sit on your throne, which I have been guarding for you this while. I have been watching for you, for my ancestors told that you would return. Welcome to this land. Rest a while. Rest in your palace."
I believe that Cortes, in fact, was taking an enormous risk in going into Tenochtitlan. But I'm not sure that the Spaniards realized that they were. They had a long history behind them of entering into the presence of the cacique, or chieftain, or king, seizing him in the course of some friendly parley and getting away with it. They also had an equally long history of winning battles. So I'm not sure that they fully realized the risk to themselves that they were taking.
Montezuma has actually moved out of his palace to make room for Cortes. It is a time of great anxiety, and Montezuma feels it is more necessary than ever to continue the sacrifices. The Lord of the Dead needs victims. From their quarters, Cortes and his men can see the grisly spectacle of the sacrificial victims being thrown down the steps of the pyramids. Finally, Cortes can endure it no more.
When Cortes and his troops first arrived in the city, Moctezuma took them to the Great Temple. And standing on top of the Great Temple, Cortes is, according to Bernal Diaz del Castillo, turns to his own priest and says to the priest, perhaps this is a good time to ask Moctezuma to remove his own sacred idol so we can put a cross here. Moctezuma, like many of the other priests and chieftains and leaders in Mexico, were repulsed by this possibility.
The presence of the Spaniards is causing conflict among the Aztec leaders. Rumors of uprising are heard throughout Tenochtitlan. In a desperate attempt to avert disaster, Cortes takes Montezuma prisoner. This is a bold maneuver while in the heart of the Aztec Empire. And to further assert his power, he displays the bound king to his people. Spaniards now feel free to put up their crosses and altars and demand that the sacrifices stop immediately.
There were many uprisings of the same kind as that led to Montezuma's death all over the Spanish Indies. It was a quite predictable process. First you seized the cacique or chieftain, and through him you ran his kingdom. But the people began not to like it, and so invariably you get secondary rebellions after the initial conquest.
As the uprising spreads, Cortes sends Montezuma out to persuade his people to stop the fighting. But the situation is out of control. Suddenly, stones rain down on Montezuma. He is mortally wounded and will die 3 days later. Though the fighting goes on for some time, the death of Montezuma marks the end of the Aztec Empire. The most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere has come to an abrupt and tragic end, defeated by a force smaller than Montezuma's palace guard. The legend of Quetzalcoatl is curiously fulfilled, and who is to say that the same omnipotent hand that created the legend did not also push Cortes to the shores of Mexico on that April day in 1519?
So many questions remain about the conquest. What if there had been a different king at the time, one not so superstitious as Montezuma? What if Cortes had not landed in 1519? Would history have been different? Perhaps not. Perhaps it was as Cortes believed, and no matter what the odds, it was his destiny to be conqueror of Mexico.
April 10, 1912. For RMS Titanic, it was her maiden voyage and her last. Just 4 days later, the ship everyone thought was unsinkable sailed at full speed into the perilous waters of the North Atlantic. An iceberg loomed up out of the dark, slicing a huge gash down her side. She took 2.5 hours to sink. In the icy waters, 1,503 people died. Less than half that number were saved. Why did so many drown? Was the captain to blame? Or was this, the world's most notorious maritime disaster, a tragedy predestined in time?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The precise point in the North Atlantic where the Titanic went down has never been satisfactorily located. On board were said to be hoards of treasure, some of it too valuable to be recorded on the ship's manifest. Gold bullion to pay for First World War armaments. A jeweled copy of the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. The personal belongings of no fewer than 57 millionaires who had chosen to sail on her. The upper decks of the Titanic, said a commentator, had a smell all of their own. A smell of perfume and of champagne and of wealth. 12,000 feet beneath the forbidding sea, she is a prize and a challenge that many men have dreamed of recovering. Yet her whereabouts remain unknown. In 1981, the Texas oil millionaire Jack Grimm went searching for her for the second year running. The search ship carried on board the most modern equipment that science could provide. Sonar detectors, underwater cameras capable of operating in spectacular detail at depths no previous expedition had ever ventured. For so large a vessel to vanish without trace is just one of the puzzles that have fascinated naval historians ever since her fated voyage. She was thought by the world at large to be unsinkable. The flagship of the White Star Line, she was the largest luxury liner ever built. She was the technological masterpiece of her time. Just as no expense was spared on her hull, her fittings were of surpassing luxury. First-class passengers could enjoy cabins with ornate carvings and plush furnishings. A lavish menu. Silk sheets adorned some beds. A maid's room adjoined each suite. Nothing was too good. Only a few pitiful human reminders were salvaged from the wreckage. The discharge book of the lookout seaman who spotted the fateful iceberg too late. The life vest that carried Mrs. John Jacob Astor, the wife of one of the millionaires, to safety. Her husband, like most men, chose to stay on board and die like a gentleman. A champagne cork from an early evening celebration. A deck chair washed into the icy waters and picked up by one of the rescue ships. The handkerchief of one of the survivors. A strangely unlucky sequence of events put the Titanic on course for disaster. The captain knew that there was ice in the area and steered 8 miles further south than planned in order to miss it. The lights on the foredeck were dimmed to give the lookouts a better view. The night was eerily calm.
Well, the first thing you usually see of an iceberg is the glint from the crystallized surface. And you see this long before you see the actual berg itself. You see a kind of glow. On this occasion, probably, the iceberg had just fallen over so that it wasn't showing a crystallized side. It was showing a side that had been under the water for a long time and was totally dark. So there was no swell, no sea, no ripples around the berg, nothing to see at all. Just a dark shadow on the water.
Immediately, 3 warning bells were rung. The huge ship was steered hard to port in a desperate attempt to miss the berg. Lewis Gorman of the Titanic Historical Society explains what happened next.
A spur of the iceberg, and as most people know, an iceberg is more below the water than above. And the spur ripped the ship below the waterline, approximately from the bow to below number 1 funnel, opening up these compartments in this area. Now, the watertight compartments in the ship are vertical. And what happened is that the forward compartments were opened. As they filled with water, the law of physics took over here, and the weight distribution changed, and the ship began to tilt. Had the ship hit the berg head-on, she would not have sunk. She would have absorbed it in maybe the first 2 compartments, and she would have maintained her floatability. However, this did not happen, and the spur of the iceberg acted as a big razor blade, opening up the compartments. As this happened, they did not realize, of course, the passengers, the extent of the damage. This was such a large and well-built ship that it felt just like a jar. Eyewitnesses' account tell us that many people didn't realize it. It was only as the ship began to settle, as things began to slide, as water in the glasses began to slant, that you realized that something was amiss.
One of the few survivors of the tragedy alive today was 7 years old at the time, traveling on the Titanic with her mother and father. Eva Hart has a vivid memory of that night.
The greatest tragedy about the Titanic is the fact that she hadn't enough lifeboats. If she'd had enough lifeboats, no one would have died. And so it was just a question of the people who were on deck first, people who were there in plenty of time, got a seat in a lifeboat. Their lives were saved. And because my mother was wide awake and fully dressed, we were up on deck right away. My mother said it was such a little bump that it reminded her of a train pulling up. You see, we were on the port side of the ship, and this tremendous gash was on the starboard side of the ship. And it certainly wasn't enough to wake me. My father went up on deck as she made him go, and he came back and said to her, "You'd better put on this very thick coat of mine, and I'll put on another one." Which he did. He put this thick coat on her, and he put another coat on himself, and he picked me up out of my bed and wrapped a blanket round me and carried me up onto the deck. And people were milling about up there. My father said to my mother, "Now stand here by this lifeboat, and whatever anyone may say to you, don't move." And we stood there, and gradually people came thronging onto the deck, and there seemed to be people rushing about, and to my recollection, a tremendous amount of noise. And he did come back and say, no, they weren't going to launch the boats. And then he went away again and came back and said, yes, they are going to launch the boats, but it's only a precaution. One of the officers told me, you'll probably be back on board for breakfast. And anyway, they launched the boats, and my father put my mother and I in. He helped other women and children. He made no attempt at all to get in himself. And we, fortunate people who were on deck in time, were saved. The others had 2.5 hours in which to wait to die, knowing that there was no means of saving them. Well, quite the most terrifying thing that I think, the thing that I can't even bear to think about now, is the sound of people drowning. when they finally were all in the water, the ship went under the water, all of which we saw, and I was wide awake. The terrible sound of people drowning, nothing to describe it. 1,503 people falling into icy water and screaming and drowning, and the noise of hissing steam. That was very prevalent. And one day when I was older, I was saying something about it to my mother, and I said, "Oh, that terrible noise." And she said to me, "Yes," and a terrible silence that followed it. And it hit me then. I realized that it did. It seemed as if everything in the world stood still after that moment.
Gradually, the full and terrible extent of the tragedy became known. While mourners grieved, newspapers started asking questions. Who was to blame? Why were there so few survivors? The hunt for a scapegoat began. The world was stunned by the tragedy of the Titanic, and ever since, writers have tried to piece together the causes of the disaster. At an inquiry headed by Lord Mersey, vital questions were asked, one by one.
I understand the Titanic was engaged in a race to beat the speed record across the Atlantic. Is this true?
She was not, as some people surmise, trying to break the speed record for the North Atlantic. She was not that fast.
The Titanic received at least 4 warnings of icebergs in the area. Why did she ignore them?
The fourth and most dramatic warning came about dinner time. This was of icebergs and growler ice right in the path that she was taking. Now, there's a lot of doubt whether this ever got to the bridge. At the time, the Titanic's radio officer was sending personal messages to the shore from the passengers, expecting to get ashore the following day, etc. And probably this message, this vital message, never got to the bridge.
Everyone thought the Titanic was unsinkable. Why then did she sink?
No marine architect would say such a ship is unsinkable. However, by the standards of design at the time, it was the best designed ship in terms of compartmentation and floatability.
Knowing there was ice in the area, why did Captain Smith not slow down or even stop like other liners in the area?
Quite simply because it was the custom of the White Star and most of the other crack transatlantic liners to get their passengers to the other side without stopping if they could avoid it. They did so because they knew that with a good lookout they could see icebergs, and unless the visibility was bad, they didn't stop. So the Titanic didn't stop, and it is only with hindsight that you might ask, why did she not stop or slow down?
How carefully did the crew look for icebergs? Can they be charged with carelessness or negligence?
In those days, there was no such thing as radar. The only procedure was extra lookouts. For example, in the forward lookout, 2 lookout men were set.
All precautions that could be taken, apart from stopping the ship, were in fact taken. The lights on the foredeck were dimmed so they wouldn't dazzle the lookouts. The lookouts were warned to look out for ice.
Every witness agrees that with enough lifeboats, every single person on the Titanic could have been saved. Why then were there so few lifeboats?
The Board of Trade, which governed the life-saving accommodation on British ships in those days, believed that if she had enough watertight compartments, they needn't have enough lifeboats, needn't have more lifeboats than a certain minimum number.
So, was no one to blame? With 1,503 people drowned, the inquiry had to come up with an explanation. The judgment was that a nearby ship, the Californian, had failed to come to the rescue quickly enough. Her captain, Stanley Lord, was censured. But ever since, there's been a fight to clear his name. Mystery still surrounds the part that the Californian played. Her radio operator, it is said, was asleep at the time. Her logbook shows she was stationary among the icebergs. Captain Lord was inexperienced in such conditions. But could she have seen the distress signals from the Titanic and failed to answer them? This was the crime for which Captain Lord was pronounced guilty. As the survivors bobbed about in their lifeboats waiting to be rescued, Undoubtedly, a ship of some sort approached.
I saw a ship, which seemed to me to be quite close by, close enough to see all her ports and the lights on her deck, and definitely not moving. And it seemed so close, and I can remember crying for a long time and saying, why doesn't that ship come to us? It wasn't big compared with the Titanic, because she was very big, but certainly it was a ship, and the outline of the ship and all the lights on it, not just some lights on the horizon.
But was this ship the Californian? Peter Padfield, having examined the evidence from both the British and American inquiries into the disaster, thinks Captain Lord was made a scapegoat.
To my mind, the evidence is conclusive. It could not have been Captain Lord, because when the Titanic sank, none of the lookouts or the officers on the watch of the Titanic could see any ships in the vicinity. Subsequently, while they were getting the boats down, a ship did appear, came towards the Titanic until she was as close as 5 miles, and you could see her side lights, and then she turned and went away again. The evidence is conclusive that the Californian was stopped during the whole night, and therefore that single fact, apart from many others, convinces me that it couldn't possibly have been the captain of the Californian.
The dispute is basically about the relative position of the two ships. According to the inquiry, the Californian was no more than 5 miles away and should easily have seen the distress signals. But in the confusion that followed the collision with the iceberg, did the Titanic signals officer make a mistake? He worked out a position by dead reckoning, based on a star sighting 6 hours before. He did not allow for drift. The currents in that part of the North Atlantic are powerful. Allowing for drift, it's possible that the Titanic and the Californian would have been separated by at least 20 miles, and the distress signals impossible to see. The matter could be settled once and for all if a search expedition could pinpoint the actual position of the Titanic. So far, this has not happened, as the chief scientist of the 1981 vessel admitted.
The one interesting thing is where the Titanic, this is where the Titanic hit the iceberg, okay? The current was drifting in this direction, and here is where they picked up the survivors hours later. You can see we have quite a few anomalies in that particular area. The scientists can't tell for sure if it's a man-made object or geological.
There is considerable doubt about whether the Titanic is still intact. Charles Haas of the Titanic Historical Society explains the possibilities.
Many survivors' accounts report that there was a loud, roaring, rumbling noise as if everything in the ship had broken loose and had crashed down to the bow. In fact, this was probably the ship's boilers. There were 29 of them, and each one weighed 90 tons, plus the ship's engines weighing hundreds of tons. And all of this tremendous weight plummeted down towards the bow, crashing and smashing its way through everything until it probably exited right through the bow of the ship. Once the ship achieved an equilibrium, it then settled back slightly and plunged downward underwater. Now, there are two theories as to what became of the ship. The first was that she continued in a nose-down position until she finally hit the bottom, striking somewhere at a speed of 30 to 50 miles an hour. The other theory said that the Titanic sank like a leaf, in that she moved back and forth through the water and suffered less damage when she finally hit the bottom.
It is on record that a number of passengers canceled their reservations, seemingly foreseeing disaster. It was an extraordinary coincidence that she should sink on her maiden voyage and that she should strike an iceberg below the waterline in the only way that made her vulnerable. Eva Hart's story of her mother's premonition of disaster is just one of many similar tales.
My father made up his mind to cut his losses here and to go to Canada. Well, he booked a first-class passage for us in the ship called the Philadelphia. Now, from the very moment that this had been decided, my mother had an extraordinary premonition, something she'd never had in her life before, never had again. Then came the day I heard my father say to her very crossly, and I wouldn't mind quite so much if you told me what it is you're so frightened of. And she said, I couldn't tell you, I don't know. But I know it's a fatal thing for us to do, we just mustn't go. And then came the news that we couldn't sail in the Philadelphia because there was a dock strike. And I really think my mother thought that was more or less a reprieve, but not my father. And one day, to his immense joy, we were told that if we paid some extra money, we could go second class in the Titanic, largest ship in the world. And then and only then did my mother say, well, now I know why I'm frightened. And he said, why are you frightened? And she said, because they say this ship is unsinkable, and that is flying in the face of God. They will never get there. And she was so right. And never again in her life did she have premonition. But to that premonition I owe my life, because my mother never went to bed in that ship. She slept in the daytime and sat up at night.
The story of the Titanic is one that raises more questions than it answers. Where exactly was she lost? Will we ever find out? What was the mystery ship that sailed so close to her in the night? A radio operator asleep. An ice warning that never reached the bridge. A collision that struck where the Titanic was most vulnerable. Could this set of circumstances be entirely accident? As a result of the Titanic tragedy, the United States Coast Guard runs an international ice patrol, and all transatlantic liners use a more southerly route. Perhaps it's a small consolation for the relatives of the 1,503 people who died on that cold April night. "400 years ago, a renowned French doctor decided to put in writing strange visions that he summoned up by occult means. He believed they foretold the future, and they have become known as the prophecies of Nostradamus. Many people have trusted them completely and even planned their lives around them. Adolf Hitler was one. The words of Nostradamus, although written 4 centuries earlier, seemed to describe Hitler uncannily. In the court of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, Nostradamus was believed. Were they all deluded? Or was there some mystic formula which Nostradamus used to foresee events yet to happen?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Early in the 16th century, Nostradamus gained fame as an astrologer after he published prophecies in verse form. Nostradamus described his method of predicting the future.
Sitting alone at night in secret study, it is placed on the brass tripod. A slight flame comes out of the emptiness and makes successful that which should not be believed in vain. The wand in the hand is placed in the middle of the tripod's legs. With water, he sprinkles the hem of his garment and his foot. A voice, fear. He trembles in his robes. Divine splendor. The god sits nearby.
Since the beginning of history, advice has been sought from prophets who foretold disasters yet to come. Mankind's belief in free will and control of our own destiny sits uneasily with a suspicion that catastrophes, natural and man-made, are in some way preordained. Nostradamus himself believed that his predictions were of fates that could be avoided, destinies that could be changed. He never doubted that he was genuinely seeing the future. He chose to write his prophecies in what are known as quatrains, four-lined rhyming verse in the Provençal dialect of southern France, which was his home. It was the time of the Inquisition, when men and women were burned for lesser heresies than the one he practiced. So he deliberately disguised and confused the quatrains, using anagrams, Latin and Greek. Specific dates are rare. Even so, his verses evoke vivid images of calamities on earth.
At sunrise, a great fire will be seen, noise and light extending towards the north. Within the globe, death and cries are heard, death awaiting them through weapons, fire and famine. The greatest army on the march put to flight will scarcely be pursued further. The army reassembled and the legion reduced, they will be driven out of France completely.
He organized his quatrains in groups of 100 called centuries. Nearly 1,000 predictions have come down to us. His fame spread with extraordinary speed after publication of the first volume in 1555. At the court of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, they were read avidly. One was of particular interest because it was thought to predict the manner of the king's death.
The young lion will overcome the older one in a field of combat in a single fight. He will pierce his eyes in their golden cage. 2 wounds in one, then he dies a cruel death.
An Italian prophet had already warned Henry II that both the beginning and end of his reign would be marked by a duel. The first duel had been fought without injury, and now it was thought that the king's jousting days were over. But the occasion of a double royal wedding of his sister and his daughter to foreign nobility proved too much of a temptation. He faced his young lion, Count Gabriel de Montgomery.
The young lion will overcome the older one in a field of combat in a single fight.
The king wore a protective visor, according to contemporary accounts, made of gold. Was this, as Nostradamus called it, a golden cage?
A field of combat in a single fight.
The 2 horsemen raced towards each other. Montgomery, too late, tried to withdraw his lance. The lance splintered, fragments driving up under the protective gold visor. Henry II took 10 agonizing days to die from septicemia. It seems such a striking confirmation of Nostradamus' prediction that Catherine de' Medici made him médecin du roi, a doctor and soothsayer by royal appointment. For the rest of his life, he was famed throughout Europe, and after his death in 1566, people began to interpret lines from his quatrains as referring to their own time. Erica Cheatham, a scholar of medieval French who has made a special study of Nostradamus, finds some of these supposed prophecies significant.
One of the things I find most convincing about Nostradamus, and personally made me really interested in following him through, was the fact he gave specific dates that occurred after his death. He writes that in 1666, the city of London should be destroyed by fire. He gives the date of the death of King Charles I, 1649. The Parliament should put the King of London to death. Louis Pasteur, the great biologist, he not only gives his name, but in the same verse he gives the founding of the Institute, 1895.
London burnt by fire in 3 times 20 plus 6.
The Great Fire of London happened in 1666. The French Revolution in 1791.
By night he will come through the forest, 2 partners, in a roundabout way. The Queen, the White Stone. The Monk King, dressed in grey at Varennes.
Marie Antoinette, her hair turned white through shock, escaped with Louis XVI secretly through the town of Varennes.
For not wanting to consent to the divorce, which then will be recognized as unworthy, the king of the islands will be forced to flee, and one put in his place who has no sign of kingship.
King Edward VII of Britain abdicated because of his love of Mrs. Simpson and spent the rest of his life in exile. His brother George, who never expected nor wanted to become king, ruled in his place. But for those who see Nostradamus as having an outstanding prophetic gift, 2 names are always put forward: Napoleon, Hitler. Both names, if they were truly foreseen by Nostradamus, were disguised or coded. Napoleon was written as an anagram: Pau, Ne, Laurent. Juggle these around, and they become Napoleon Roy, Napoleon the King. Napoleon, after his defeat at Waterloo, was exiled on the tiny island of Elba. After his escape and his victorious 100 days, a new empire began to grow for him.
Stained with murder and enormous adulteries, the great enemy of all mankind, he will be worse than his ancestors, uncles and fathers, in steel, fire and water, bloody and inhuman.
Out of nearly 1,000 such quatrains that Nostradamus wrote, how many can be interpreted as having come true? Scholars such as Erica Cheatham think the proportion is very high.
In my opinion, I think perhaps 73% is a rough average of what has come true, but remember that does cover a span of 400 years.
As Hitler advanced through Europe, his colleague Goebbels was busy orchestrating a propaganda campaign based on the 400-year-old prophecies. True or not, they were to have an effect on the strategy of the Second World War. It was Frau Goebbels, wife of the Nazi propaganda minister, who first alerted Hitler to the strangely accurate way that Nostradamus seemed to describe events leading to the war in Europe. Ellick Howe, a former British intelligence agent, detailed to assess the influence of Nostradamus on Hitler, explains what happened.
Around the 20th of November, 1940, once Goebbels was actually sleeping at home with his wife. She was reading a book about ancient prophecies, and she was so excited about what she read about a particular prophecy which had been attributed to Nostradamus that she woke her husband up and said, Joseph, you must listen to this. There's this prophecy that there'd be a war in Poland in 1939 and it would be the end of the British Empire. And a couple of days later, Goebbels was instructing his stooges at the propaganda ministry to prepare, without delay, a Nostradamus leaflet for the benefit of the French in order to depress and mislead them.
No fewer than 13 quatrains seem to refer to Hitler, sometimes calling him Hister, sometimes the great or greatest leader, and describing the swastika as the crooked cross. Even before hostilities began, military leaders on the French side began to dig the Maginot Line, according to instructions apparently given by Nostradamus.
A great trench, earth excavated. The water will be divided into 15 parts.
The Nuremberg Rally and the invasion and occupation of France.
When the greatest man carried off the prize of Nuremberg, battle is joined with the French. He makes preparations. Some will regard him as good, others bad or uncertain.
Italy and the pact with Mussolini.
Not far from Venice, the two greatest ones of Asia and Africa will be said to come from the Rhine and Hitler.
Mussolini's black-clothed fascists and the pact with Hitler.
Liberty will be occupied by a black, proud and villainous man. By Hitler, the Republic of Venice will be vexed.
Aerial warfare and the Battle of Britain.
He will use thunderbolts, so many in such an array. The machine of flying fire will come.
A skeptic would call these quatrains obscure and irrelevant. And was Nostradamus genuinely foreseeing a swastika when he wrote the following?
The great pontiff by the warlike party who will subjugate the borders of the Danube. The cross pursued by hook or crook. Captives, gold, jewels, more than 100,000 rubies.
And are even the references by name to Napoleon and Hitler as accurate as they first appear? Author John Sladek does not think so.
There are hundreds of Napoleon quatrains in the prophecies, mainly because I think the 19th century French scholars kept going over and over Nostradamus and digging out anything that could be anything to do with Napoleon. But the one I noticed particularly is supposed to have an anagram of Napoleon, which is P-A-U N-A-Y-L-O-R-O-N. If anybody can make Napoleon out of this, they're a pretty good mystic themselves. In fact, it could be an anagram of just about anything. It could be an anagram of your pal Anon. There are a number of predictions which refer to something or someone called Hister, H-I-S-T-E-R. And this is usually taken by the Nostradamus believers as Hitler. But in fact, it was a reference to the Danube River, which was called the Ister River in Nostradamus' time.
It is said in defense of Nostradamus that he made his prophecies deliberately obscure in order to escape the charges of heresy and witchcraft. Moreover, if it is possible to look into the future, Everyone in history who has attempted to do so has said that the picture is uncertain and indistinct, as if they are permitted only glimpses of what might be.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Ron Warmoth, modern psychic, often consulted by the business community, explains foretelling the future.
And the true psychic part, or precognitive part, which is being able to sort of see around the bend in the river, as Einstein put it, is relatively rare in that sense where it's completely without any sort of an input. I do believe that, that we can prevent future events. I'm not a fatalist. I happen to believe that we do have free choice. And I feel that being forewarned is being forearmed, which means that if a psychic tells you something that's negative, you can change it.
If the Nostradamus predictions come true in our lifetime, might they help to establish his authenticity? They speak of actions begun by a man in France leading to a crisis in Persia, the land now called Iran. It was indeed in France that the Ayatollah Khomeini lived in exile before returning to take over from the Shah. Erica Cheatham finds this completely convincing.
When I wrote it initially, I said that this particular prediction was rubbish. It's in number 70 in Century 1. It talks of a man in a turban who shall sit in France plotting the downfall of the Emperor of Persia. Unbelievable.
Another quatrain can be taken to predict that the Prince of England will marry and that he will be the last prince on the English throne. Lastly, he seems, according to Erica Cheatham, to speak of the San Andreas Fault. A great earthquake. He gives an astrological date, the sun in 20 degrees of Taurus, which means May the 10th. He does not give the year. The overthrow of Ayatollah Khomeini, the last king of England, the eruption of the San Andreas earthquake on May the 10th. If all these happened, would it be just coincidence? One striking aspect of the prophecies of Nostradamus is that where they seem to mean something, they have often been unfulfilled. Hitler saw himself as the conqueror of Europe and Russia. Neither Nostradamus nor any of his astrologers foresaw his downfall. Napoleon believed he would win at Waterloo, as predicted by Nostradamus. He lost.
There's certain quatrains which were taken to mean the French Revolution, and then were taken to mean the Napoleonic Wars, and then were taken to mean the First World War, and then were taken to mean the Second World War. So I don't suppose anything that's that vague really is of any value at all as far as predictive power.
So far, a lot of the things he said have come true, or there has been accuracy there, because I believe he did predict the Second World War. He's predicted also to do with the massacre of the Jewish race. He also predicted a great deal to do with Hitler. He also predicted a lot of our problems we have with Russia, and many different things, and he has been very accurate. I mean, I think it has to speak for itself.
In the end, perhaps most prophecies mean just what the listener intends them to mean. Possibly those rare, true glimpses of the future that some people seem to have are half coincidence and half foresight. Perhaps they owe as much to self-fulfillment as to the supernatural. We cannot be sure. Only in the last 100 years has the human race begun to ask the question, were we always human? It was not until 1973, when an anthropologist happened to look down at the crumbling soil of Ethiopia, that we achieved a new look at our past. A single broken bone can sometimes be a time machine. Did it transport us to a moment when the link between man and ape walked the earth?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The Great Rift Valley of East Africa extends 1,000 miles to one of the most desolate spots on Earth, the Afar Triangle. In 1973, a French-American team began to search the area, which they suspected could be rich in pre-human fossils. What they found may have pushed the story of humanity back to 3.5 million years ago. October. Don Johanson was leader of the American team. This reenactment, based on his book, Lucy, shows how he literally stumbled onto the first of 3 amazing discoveries. The bone seemed to be the shin of a small primate. Upright walking humans had never been found in soil this old, soil which team geologists had dated to 3.5 million years BC. He carefully marked and cataloged the spot. Johansen spotted another bone. He couldn't believe his luck. Fossil limbs are extremely rare, and his 2 fragments fit into a perfect knee joint. What he noticed next took his breath away. He knew that the knees of apes meet in a straight line, human knees at a slight angle. This knee looked almost human. That evening, Johansen and one of his graduate students snuck outside of camp to a nearby Afar burial mound. Johansen kept insisting he had to find a human femur for comparison. The student was worried. The Afar zealously guard their ancestral mounds. If the anthropologists were caught robbing graves, they might be shot, or worse. Luckily, inside the mound was a modern femur. Except for size, the bones were almost exactly the same. They respectfully replaced the femur. From the knee joint alone, Johansen suspected the unknown creature walked upright. His subsequent discoveries were to revolutionize our beliefs of when the first human walked the earth. The following year, Johansen returned to the Afar with a larger group. The digs began to yield dramatic finds: prehistoric hippos, crocodiles, the huge skull of an extinct mastodon. Meanwhile, the painstaking search continued for human ancestors. They would have considered themselves lucky that season to find a single pre-human bone. That's why the events of late November were unbelievable. Johansen hit his second streak of luck. Crossing down a small gully, he spotted a bone. And another. They pulled out a vertebrae, part of an arm, and more. Had they found King Solomon's mines, the scientists could not have been more overjoyed. What they dug from the dry soil would eventually bring them fame, scientific acclaim, and a backlash of controversy that continues to this day. For they had found a full-grown woman, 3.5 feet tall, weighing 50 pounds. A woman who was not quite human. Dr. Johansen and his colleague, Dr. Tim White, analyzed the fossils and later named the new species.
Well, what we see here is one of the most remarkable discoveries that's ever been made in the study of human origins. We have a skeleton which is about 40% complete. Normally, we're happy when we find a bit of a jaw or a bit of an arm, and here we've got parts of legs, parts of arms, parts of the skull, nearly a complete lower jaw. And she's popularly come to be known as Lucy. To anthropologists around the world, she's known as Australopithecus afarensis, or the Afar ape man. And she represents for us the oldest, most complete human ancestor known from anywhere in the world.
What Lucy shows us is a creature that was a mosaic creature. Her hip, her knee, her foot would have been very human in appearance, and yet when we look to parts of her face, represented here by her lower jaw, we find that it's very protruding lower portion of the face. We have portions of her brain case, and they show that the brain was very, very small, smaller even than some modern chimpanzees.
We have been looking and are always looking for various links in the evolutionary chain. And one of the interesting links in the evolutionary chain, which has been filled by the discovery of Lucy, is this intermediate form. That is to say, we've got a form that's fully upright, walking on 2 legs, just as modern humans do, but still has a lot of evolutionary change necessary to make it truly human in the teeth and the face, the jaws, and the size of the skull. So here we have essentially found a very interesting and provocative link between something that was partly human and partly ape-like.
What did Lucy look like? No record of skin color or hair density remains. This reenactment is one possible interpretation. In the hostile environment around primitive African lakes, frequented by large predators, Lucy's upright walking may have offered a new talent for survival. For the first time in primate evolution, the hands were free, hands which were shaped just like ours.
We can assume that these hominids were at least as intelligent as a modern chimpanzee. But we can't assume that they were more intelligent or that they had speech or anything like that because we don't have any record of their tools. We don't find a stone tool record until much later in time, much younger than Lucy.
The upright walk of a human, the strength and agility of an athlete, and the brain of a chimpanzee. Could Lucy talk? Could she reason? Could she remember the past and plan for the future? According to Johansen and White, not very much. The talent for stone tool making would not come for another 1,000,000 years. In that sense, Lucy was still an animal. Not all scientists agreed with this interpretation. A year after the Lucy find, Johansen was again in the field, seeking more evidence, and again he struck gold. A movie crew was present when his team unearthed an entire pre-human family, at least a dozen who somehow perished together. In the years since this monumental discovery, scientists are still arguing its meaning. Some experts claim the bones represent not 1, but 3 species, that Lucy was completely human, that Lucy was a knuckle-walking ape, that Lucy's family evolved into humans. The controversy continues. If Lucy is our predecessor, and if the date of her life and death and 3.5 million years is correct, this little creature who lived without speech or reasoned thought would be the ancestor of me, of you, of all of us, 200,000 generations removed. 1 million generations before Lucy, fossil fragments have been found of little primates called Ramapithecus. The theory of evolution claims these monkeys as our ultimate ancestors. A few footprints in Texas rocks, however, might prove that Lucy doesn't belong to us at all, that evolution is wrong and the Bible right. If the theory of natural evolution is correct, then the Earth must be very old. What scientists call the geologic column is layer after layer of rocks built up over time. A slice through this birthday cake would expose 4 billion years of slow change. Human bones would be found only in the very top, and dinosaur bones only in the middle.
Today, most scientists would agree. Most, but not all. A growing number of scientists who call themselves creationists interpret these strata very differently. They believe the world and man were created about 10,000 years ago, and most of these rock layers were deposited during Noah's flood. It's hard to imagine a more controversial split today in the ranks of science.
At the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, scientists are gathering to coordinate and publish their interpretation of origins. The Creation Research Society now claims 700 PhDs and Masters of Science. John Morris is one of their experts in geology.
I feel that humans lived throughout the entire geologic column, and that the geologic column could very well have been, and in fact I feel was, laid down by a single major hydraulic catastrophe.
Dr. Morris was principal investigator on one of the most amazing bits of creationist evidence ever found, the footprints in the Paluxy River in Texas.
It was about the turn of the century, 1908, something like that, when there was a major flood on the Paluxy River. And the people then began to see markings in the rock that they had never seen before and didn't understand. They were these huge prints of these bird-like creatures with 3 toes, things of this nature, and soon people figured out they were dinosaur footprints, and it was an amazing find.
Discovery of the dinosaur prints attracted many scientists to this rural area. Some of the huge tracks were removed to various universities, and some were sold on the black market. Today, the area is incorporated into Dinosaur State Park to protect the remaining tracks. The giant reptile prints are fascinating, but other nearby tracks are more difficult to explain. Creationists claim they are human footprints in the same Cretaceous layer, placed at the same time as the dinosaur prints. Yet the theory of evolution insists humans and dinosaurs never coexisted.
This, I think, is one of the main evidences for the revision of the geologic column. To find humans and dinosaurs together is totally incompatible with our modern-day concepts of evolution and uniformitarianism.
Then, evidence came to light that some of the prints may have been fakes. A team of creationists excavated, attempting to answer once and for all the charges of a hoax.
Throughout the 60s and around 68 to 71 or so, there was a whole lot of activity at the Paluxy River to uncover new prints, go back into the river, to turn over new rock shells where the river has not been before, where there's no chance of carving. These prints are inside, in place, and there's no chance that they were carved. These are prints as they were laid down in the original mud, which later turned to limestone.
6 new trails were exposed, startling evidence for the creationist claim. The Bible tells explicitly the creation of the world, not in 4 billion years, but in 6 days. creationists, there is only one origin of the species: divine creation. Animals were made in their own kind, and Adam was fashioned from dirt in the image of God. For evolutionists, blind chance changed simians into sapiens. Dr. Duane Gish, a biochemist, has written that man did not evolve, that fossils such as Neanderthal and Lucy are misinterpretations of deformed humans or extinct apes.
I believe that these creatures, such as the Australopithecines, were apes, not intermediate, and they were certainly not men. The primates make up one of the 32 orders of mammals, and as George Gaylord Simpson, one of the world's leading evolutionists, has stated, every one of these 32 orders of mammals have appeared with their distinct ordinal characteristics already complete. In other words, from the very start, when the first time you see a bat, it's a bat. A whale is a whale, a primate is a primate, and a hoofed animal is a hoofed animal. And there are no transitional forms, no intermediate going back to their supposed ancestral order.
The Paluxy prints are one of many claims which have fired a recent scientific controversy. A controversy which is often very heated.
Well, I think that the only place that we have definitive evidence for humans and dinosaurs existing together is in cartoons. And essentially what we're looking at probably is somebody's attempt to pull a joke on scientists.
Science, by their definition, is the attempt to explain everything without a supernatural. Now, to me, that is incompatible with science as it calls itself a search for truth, because if there is truth outside the naturalistic scheme of things, then any attempt to explain things without a supernatural element is doomed to failure. And I feel that much of evolution science is doomed to failure because of that very assumption.
It may be that those human footprints that are there, I've not seen them, were simply carved in the same rock levels in which you found dinosaur footprints.
Right. These have never been published in the scientific literature, and scientists have never been invited to critically examine the footprints.
No,
until that happens.
We would welcome an opportunity to go and look at these footprints and to investigate them personally.
Most of the journals that publish scientific literature are committed to an evolutionary position, an evolutionary framework. And articles that would be antagonistic toward that viewpoint would seldom be approved for publication. On many occasions, creationists have written to journals to publish articles, or even letters to the editor, that sort of thing, and very, very seldom are they published.
There's a sense that people say there's this discontinuity between the family of man and the family of apes, but if we look at extant forms, living forms today, and we study the anatomy, we study the biochemistry, we study the blood, we study the actual DNA sequences, we find out that there is a lot of overlap between apes and humans, and obviously somewhere in the past they shared a common ancestor.
Now the similarities in the proteins, of course, are not startling. That we would predict that on the basis of creation. Because we are living in the same world, we are drinking the same water, eating the same food, breathing the same air, we have exactly the same metabolic problems. We believe God, the Creator, then, having solved these problems, would have essentially used the same solution in each case. But the distinguishing features between man and chimpanzees are really startling. Of course, he has a brain about 1/3 of ours, and the many other characteristics of chimpanzee are tremendously different than man. He has no ability to speak. He does not think abstractly. Does not think into the future. Does not think about the past. Very, very different from man. He is indeed an animal. We are human.
Okay, one of the things that modern creationists are trying to do is to masquerade under a banner called scientific creationism and act as though they are actually scientists working within the scientific forum. This is not true. In fact, what these people have are a set of beliefs, usually based on the chapter of Genesis in the Bible. And instead of testing their propositions and trying to answer questions, they already have the answers, and they're not asking any questions.
There's no way that we can construct testable scientific theories about origins. Evolution is no more scientific than creation, and it's certainly as religious. It is a basic dogma of humanism, atheism, agnosticism, and things of that nature.
The debate has moved from the laboratory to the classroom to the courtroom. It was once thought settled. It probably never will be.
Lower third.
Those scientists who espouse evolution and those who believe in creation will probably never close the gap. Hopefully, they can agree on one point. Science needs healthy skepticism.
And we shouldn't forget the famous Nebraska man, based upon a single tooth found in western Nebraska in 1922. Some of the world's greatest authorities were very excited by this discovery, and they were convinced it was part of a primitive subhuman ancestor of man. And the Illustrated London News had their artist draw a picture of this creature. It turned out to be very manlike. Showed a picture of the man and his wife and the tools that they were using based upon this single tooth. However, a few years later, they discovered the skeleton of this creature, the remainder of the skeleton, and it turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. It turned out to be a pig. Now, again, the startling thing is that great authorities had mistaken a pig's tooth for an evolutionary form of man. Now, they were honest scientists. They were very good scientists and very careful scientists. What had happened? You see, this is what they had wanted to find, this is what they had expected to find, and therefore this is what they tended to see.
The search for the missing links of our origin will continue. Perhaps we really hope to find our destiny.